Hi, welcome to my talk. I'm Jess McNally, and this is my talk, Project Management Plans. What are they, and do I need one? So I'm Jess. As I said before, I'm a certified project manager, and I'm currently working as a producer at Summerfall Studios in Melbourne. I've previously worked at Fire Monkeys, EA with Rio Racing 3, Sims Free Play, and also worked with Simon Boxer and Humble Games to produce Ring of Pain. So looking forward to talking to you today about project management plans. It's not something we talk about a lot in production, but they really are a helpful tool for you to be able to go through and really examine what you're delivering, why you're delivering, how you're delivering it, and when you're delivering it. So let's go through the overall structure of the project management plan, and then we'll go into a breakdown of all of the different sections. So first off, what's a project management plan? A project management plan is a single document that defines how and by what mechanisms you're going to deliver, monitor, and control your project. So a lot of times we focus on the delivery side of project management. We don't spend a lot of time talking about monitoring and controlling a project. So how are you actually going to, and when are you going to monitor your project? And how are you going to, what mechanisms are you going to control your projects by, whether that be steering committees, stage gates, risk meetings, what mechanisms are you going to put into your project and into your processes in order to control that project? So the project management plan can also be used as a formal approval document for project stages or milestones. So really what this is a set of deliverables and a commitment to say that this is what we will be delivering by this date, and this is the definition of those deliverables. So if you have something like a steering committee, you can use that as a formal approval document to move through your project stages and tick those off. It can also be a good high-level outline of the project, which you can use to talk to people about what you're delivering. This can be both inside your immediate team, but also external, so external stakeholders that are working with you on the team but might not be part of your immediate team. This is a really good way to pull out the high level and present that to them in terms of what your roadmap looks like, what your schedule looks like, and how you're planning to manage the project. This might be for a specific discipline, and you may have some processes specific to that discipline. This document allows you to pull all that together in a way that would allow you to kind of present one pages and present high level documents to your stakeholders. So what's made up? What is in a project management plan? So essentially these are the sections which you could consider putting into your plan. The project management plan itself is usually a Word or Google document, and it then outlines and breaks down into these sections how you're going to manage each of those individual sections and individual pieces of scope or schedule that you are looking to manage in your project. It really just helps you look at your project and break it down in a holistic way, and can often be a trigger or a reminder for you for all of the different things that could be impacting your team and your delivery. So let's kick off and go through to scope management. So scope management, this is really about what is the full scope of what is being delivered for you. So in games, that for us is often, I guess, an alpha, a beta, and then our full builds. But what outside of that, and obviously your assets, what outside of that are you actually also delivering? So are there code changes and features which you need to deliver? Are there additional supports such as localization, translation, testing? What else are you delivering? So this is essentially the section for you to describe everything that you're delivering as part of the projects. So within that, you'll have your work breakdown structure or your schedule. And then really what you want to have is some sort of roadmap or high level communication of your schedule so that people can look at it and kind of have an idea of when your main delivery dates and milestones are scheduled. So how are you going to prioritize your scope? What mechanisms are you going to use to assess your scope, and how will that be handled? what is specifically out of scope for your project? This is one that, again, I think is very good for communicating what you will not do. We often think about what we will do, but for the sake of delivering games, I think it's really important to also call out what is out of scope, what we definitely consider is not part of our project. So how often and when will you review your scope? Who will review it and how? And what mechanisms will you have in order to assess changes? Who's the approver of those changes? So really documenting down to, I guess, a very detailed level of process, how you intend and how you are managing your project. So are there any scope assumptions that we're making as part of our overall scoping? And how and when are we planning to verify those? So that can be something as simple as we've made some very high level estimates at the start of the project. When do we want to go back and review those and update those now that we've learned a little bit more and we're further along the project? So just an example of a scope assumption you might be making. You might also be making some scope assumptions around availability of resources and the amount of work that you can get done in terms of your velocity. So what are they, and what are the mechanism points within your project that you're going to stop and have a look at these and update them? So that's essentially scope management in a nutshell. There are a lot of other things that could be part of this, but this is really, I guess, the main group of questions that you really want to answer and be trying to document in your scope management section. I just want to stop here for a second and I guess outline something that is important in project management planning, and that is make the document your own. There is a standard template that you can use, and you could have a look, Google that and have a look. But essentially, if there are sections and things that do not make sense for your project, don't include them. So what I'm saying here is that these are a list of questions that you could be considering for yourself and the types of things that would be within this section, but really tailor the document to your project and what you're delivering. If it doesn't make sense to answer these questions, or if you're not at a stage where you can answer these questions yet, then document as much as you can and then move on and have a date where you come back and you revisit this document in order to update your scope management or any sections that you need updating. So I guess that leads me to another important point that I wanted to make before I go any further, which is that this is a living document. So what that means essentially is that this is a document that is current to and will be continuously updated. When you have more information, when you potentially change the way that you're managing things, this document should essentially be a document that you could hand over at any point that would describe the current workings of your project and how you're managing that project and the processes by which you're managing that project. So essentially this document will continue to change, and the things that you put in at the start of your delivery cycle will be completely different to potentially how you're implementing them at the end of your delivery cycle. So before anyone starts, I guess, before I freak anybody out thinking that they need to know all of this information, there are plenty, particularly at the start of your project, you will have less information. So it will be, you won't have a lot of information to be able to fill out these sections. As you move through the project, you will start to have more and more discussions and more documentation that's related to how you're managing your project, and your processes will change. So this document changes along with that. So that's all on on scope management. Let's move now to schedule. So this one is just essentially when you're going to be delivering and what you're going to be delivering, as well as any potential risks or how you're going to be managing your schedule. So any processes or risks that you will be using in order to deliver your schedule. So there's the things in this section that you want to be thinking about. What does the overall project management look like, roadmap look like? When are your project milestones or stage gates? And are there any internal team ones that you're looking at developing? How much contingency has been included within the schedule, and where is that contingency? That's really important to be able to call out and to be able to identify, because when you're tracking your velocity, it's really easy to be able to lose track of how much contingency you have left. So really calling out where your sections of contingency are, whether that be, in this case, schedule, and where you potentially intend to be using those. Once you have an idea, obviously, of where that might be used, it's a good idea to be including contingency in your schedule, in all of your high-level tasks, just to give yourself that little bit of flexibility in terms of delivery dates. How will you manage your schedule? So how often will you review it? How will you communicate it to your team? And how will you manage any changes to that schedule? Who's responsible for managing the schedule and making any changes to that? So again, this is more about who is responsible for that schedule, and who will be reviewing it and making changes or approvals to that schedule. Are there any risks that currently exist within your schedule? So this is an interesting one as well that I think we should be pairing, I guess, alongside your contingency planning. So do you have any risks in your schedule? So risks that you won't make your date, risks that you won't get your resources, risks that you won't meet your velocity, and how are you going to look to mitigate those risks? So whether that be the use of contingency, whether that be hiring, how are you going to look to mitigate any of those potentially risky periods that we have within our schedule? How will your changes to your schedule be managed and communicated? So not only to, I guess, your internal team, and how will you gain feedback on that, which I think is also critical when we're planning our schedules, is to make sure that we have also gained our team's feedback on the doability of that schedule. So how do we communicate those changes to our team? How do we re-estimate and re-scope? And how will we communicate that out? So if we have external stakeholders that we need to speak to, for example, your publishers, then there's potentially, how do you want to communicate any changes to schedule, and the reasons for those? How will any deviations from your forecast baseline schedule be managed? So I just want to touch on baseline scheduling here just for a second. So a baseline schedule is essentially a schedule that you lock in once you are 70 to 80% happy or confident in the actual high-level schedule. The baseline schedule serves, it is a schedule that is locked in essentially, and then the rest of the scheduling or the updated schedules that happen as part of delivery are then measured against that baseline schedule to see how much difference there is between the two. Essentially what that's doing is really looking for a way to make the schedule and the variability of the schedule within your overall project reduce the amount of deviation within that. So it's really just a way of measuring and trying to control your schedule throughout the project, through your project stages. Let's move on to budget. So what is this one? This section is essentially, what is your budget? What are the contingencies that are in your budget? Who manages that budget, and who is approving it? So it's essentially, in a nutshell, trying to convey what your overall budget is, what the main ticket items are, how are you communicating that budget, and who's approving any changes. So what contingency exists in the budget? If there is contingency, how is accessing this funding managed? So is there someone that you need to go to for an approval? Do you need to speak to your publisher? Is this, what is your change control policy? And how are you, how will you access any funding that you need to, including accessing contingency? So how are the budget decisions communicated? So for example, you want to add another feature, but it is going to cost another 2 weeks of time into the schedule. How do we assess and estimate that? And who is making the ultimate decision around the sign-off of that particular piece of work, moving that into scope, and then approving any impact to budget? What is your forecast daily or monthly cost for development? So this is working out what your overall run rate is, so that you know and understand and are scheduling any payments that are coming in or any funding that's coming in to make sure that you cover all of your development costs from the time that you have started developing to when that time that milestone funding is likely to come in, or back-end profit funding when you have released your game. So what are your anticipated funding needs and milestones? Understand what those are, how much money you need to cover that, and then make sure that you are looking to try and understand, I guess, how much your run rate is costing and the anticipated milestones coming up. And what's the process for your changes to budget? So for example, like we talked through before, if there is a change request and an impact to budget, who is approving that process? Who is approving that budget change, and what process are we going through? Are we submitting a small change request, outlining all of the details? Is it an email? So just really outlining what process you're going to use to potentially change your budget and manage your change requests. Resourcing. So resourcing, what is required essentially to deliver your project successfully? This is a list of all of the resources you might need to deliver your project, as well as when these resources are required and for how long. Just a note here on resourcing: in project management widely, team is included within resourcing. I don't like the idea of including my team within that, so I like to break them out into separate sections. You of course can include them in resourcing. I just wanted to make a note here that I specifically call out team as a section within my project management plans, because I think that there are a lot of things that we talk about in relation to team that are a little bit different to physical resources that we might require. So moving on to that, team. How will the team be managed, and who is the team, and how long will we need them for? So will you be doing one-on-ones with them, regular reviews, stand-ups? Essentially, what is the process for team management? What project methodology will be used to track and communicate team deliverables? So how will we communicate project velocity to our team members, and also project targets and goals? What processes will be in place to manage your team's workload? So how will you manage that team workload and assess that the work you are setting for the team for the period is enough for the team, and that the estimates are correct, enough or not too much? So how do we avoid burnout and make sure that our team has enough work to do, but we're not pushing them too hard? What is the HR and staffing management process, and who is HR in your team? So this may be easily identifiable for those working in businesses that have a large number of 300 staff. For smaller teams, this may be more of a single person to go to. So what is the HR staffing process for your company, and or this project, and how will you be managing it? Another one that kind of moves on from that is, how will your team health be tracked and monitored? So how often are you going to check in with your team? So whether that be one-on-ones, are you going to be running team health surveys on a regular basis? So how are you going to track and monitor your team's health and well-being? And how will you create a safe psychological space for them to be in to provide feedback, whether that be positive or negative feedback? So moving on to quality. So this section is really defining what the acceptable levels of quality are, and how will you assess quality within your project. So how will you assess your quality within the project? How is this defined for each discipline of the project? So the quality levels, or the quality definitions for code, for production, for art, are all going to be very different for UI. So how do we define what that is and what that looks like for each discipline, so that they know when they've hit it, when we all understand when we hit that? How and when will quality be measured? So how often will we be reviewing and giving feedback around our quality? What is the definition of the acceptable level of quality? Or shippable, as we like to say. So what is that definition, and what does that look like for each of your disciplines? And how will lower than anticipated quality be managed? So this one is more talking about, so if something is delivered that is lower than your anticipated level of quality, so that it's just not working for your game, how will you approach that? Is there time in the schedule for contingency for things like that? How will you assess that it is lower level of quality, and what sort of things how would you approach something that is of lower level of quality, or is not working for your game? So do you have time in your schedule to do that, or are there ways to work around that? This doesn't necessarily want you to have the answer for everything in terms of how you would manage specific processes. This is more asking, if there was an item that was delivered within your project that was lower than your expected level of quality, how would you manage that? So think about it more at a higher level. So let's move on to stakeholders. So who are your project stakeholders? So how do you break those stakeholders down? Who needs to know what, and when do they need to know it? So a useful tool here is a stakeholder matrix, or a RACI. So a RACI stands for responsible, accountable, communicated, or consulted, and informed. Really, this is a way of breaking down your stakeholder matrix across the project, and identifying who is responsible for the overall deliverable, who is accountable for delivering the deliverable, who is consulted within that deliverable, and who is informed about that particular decision or that deliverable. So if you want some examples of those, please contact me. Also, please feel free to Google them. There is some standard templates out there. But it is a really good way of breaking down for you who needs to be consulted and informed on decisions, but also who is responsible for signing off and approving those decisions, and who is responsible for the doing of the decisions. So this can be a really useful tool to communicate with external stakeholders as well, dependent on your team. How will the team communicate with your stakeholders? Are you holding meetings, Zoom calls? Obviously we're all on Zoom at the moment, but how often will you be providing reporting, and how often will you be catching up with them and communicating with them? And what are your escalation points for your stakeholders? So not only for you into your stakeholders, but what are the escalation points back into your team for your stakeholders if they need to contact you? Communications. So, do you have a communications plan? A communications plan is a separate document that breaks down the overall change cycle, including the overall impact to people mentally and in terms of their physical space and how that's being impacted, as well as how their overall role will potentially be changing. So communications plans, how will we communicate? When will we communicate, and what will we communicate? So this is really thinking about change planning and trying to line up some of your strategy in terms of communication, but also this would be an addendum to your marketing plan. So essentially, you've got your marketing beats and your marketing plans, and then you will have your communication plan about how would we communicate that our marketing plans are coming about, when would we communicate them, and what will we communicate about them. This can also be something that you can approach within your individual teams. So how often will you communicate with your team? When will we communicate, and what will we communicate? So making sure that the meetings that you have scheduled, for example, in your teams, are appropriate for the people that are there. So this can also relate to your overall development cycles in terms of individual ceremonies, like a stand-up. So how will you communicate within your stand-ups? When will you have those? And what will you communicate in those versus potentially a team meeting? So what resources or documentation will be required throughout your project to communicate? who is impacted by those changes and what are the impacts, and what is the level of impact of the changes. So understanding that we have, as humans, an overall response to change within a change cycle, and that typically kind of has a negative start and then moves up into a positive impact dependent on how those changes are communicated. So this communication plan is really breaking down the impacts so that you can address your communications correctly. Change management. So how will you handle changes to your project, and what is the process of change management that you're going to use to approach this project? Who's responsible for making the changes, and who's responsible for approving the changes? Also, what process will be used to facilitate those changes? So again, when we talked earlier about budget, is this an email? Is this a steering committee submission? How will this work? How will the changes be communicated to the team and stakeholders? And how will those changes be assessed for overall impact? So the level of impact not only on budget, but the rest of the project in terms of resourcing, schedule, all of these other sections, how will we look at those and determine the impact of the change on our project? Risk management. So this is, again, one I don't think we talk about very often in games, but I just wanted to talk about it. Again, this is one of those sections that if you don't feel like it applies to you, that's okay. I do feel quite strongly that most, if not all, deliverables are going to have an aspect of risk, and so risk management is one of those things that you should really be thinking about. So not only risks, but how will risks, issues, assumptions, and dependencies be managed? So I just wanted to talk through, I guess, the difference between risks, issues, assumptions, and dependencies. So risks are really the potential for something to go wrong and impact your project. An issue, on the other hand, is something that is already happening, already in motion, it's already impacting your project. An assumption is something that you have made about your project. For example, that could be scope related, it could be resource related, and you are making an assumption that this will either continue or that this is true about your project. And dependencies are, I guess, the different types of tasks that are dependent on each other to start. For example, the art team needs to create assets before code can put them in engine. So this is a dependency on the assets being available before code can start their work. Essentially anything that would be a blocker to somebody else moving on and starting their work. So how will these risks, issues, assumptions, and dependencies be documented, and how will they be communicated? How often will you talk about them? How will you document them? Will they just be in a list? Will they be in a risk register? And how often will you talk about them? So how will you include the team in talking about those risks? And do you want to include the team? So how does a team member raise a risk or an issue or an assumption or a dependency? And how do we track those? So are we having regular meetings to talk about risks and issues? Is it a kind of ad hoc thing that is happening? How are you planning to manage your risks? So who's responsible for managing the risks, and who is accountable for any accepted risk? So an accepted risk here is something that could occur and could impact the project, but that the project has accepted as an ongoing risk, and that usually this would happen after you have tried to mitigate a risk or reduce its overall impact, and once the mitigants have kind of run out, this is often an accepted operational risk. What assumptions does the project have, and how can these be verified, and when do we want to verify them? As we talked about earlier in scope, we may have made some assumptions about how things may have worked, and once we've come to implementation, that that approach may not work. So what assumptions are we making at this particular point whilst you're writing your project management plan, and how are we planning to verify them? What risks does the project have, and how can we mitigate them? So how can we reduce the overall severity or the overall impact to the project? Are there things that we can do that will reduce the overall likelihood of it occurring or the overall impact of the occurrence? What issues does the project have, and how can these be resolved or have their impact reduced? So what things do we have that are currently impacting development, and how can we reduce or remove those particular issues? And what dependencies does the project have, as we talked through earlier? Other sections to consider. So as I started talking about earlier, just before we went through the sections, make the project management plan your own. If there are sections that make sense for you to document, add those sections. So for me, there are some other sections that you could consider adding along the way once you are using a project management plan. So that is knowledge management. How are you going to manage the knowledge within your business or within this game that you're delivering? What tools are you going to use to document that? What documents are you going to require along the way if they are attached to any potential stage gates or milestones for your team? And I guess what mechanisms are you going to use to record that knowledge along the way? So that leads me into lessons learnt. This is a document that is just a tracker of all of the lessons that we've learnt along the way whilst delivering a project. That might be, we tried to deliver a feature in this way in Engine and it didn't quite work out the way we wanted, but this is the way that we then ended up approaching this. What we've learnt from this is X. So that's really just a list of all of your lessons learned throughout the project that you would review on a regular or a semi-regular basis, whether that lines up with your milestones, to kind of look back and reflect around some of the lessons we've learned. Process management, another section to consider. So how are you going to document and develop your processes? Often within game development, we are creating processes and adjusting processes on the fly. So how are we going to document those processes and make sure that everyone is using the same processes and that they are efficient? So how will we communicate them? And when will we reassess our processes to make sure that they're working for the team? This is often one I add to my project management plans because I feel quite strongly, and I've come from a strong process background. Project methodology. So this is one that doesn't necessarily need to be there, but again, coming from a heavy project methodology background from working in banking, I often will talk about the project methodology that we are using for the project to deliver the game, how often we will look at that, and just to really break down what the ceremonies that you are using to deliver the project, and making sure that these are relevant as well. This can be really useful information for new starters within your team, and would often be replicated in your handbooks. Testing approach. So this is another one that I think deserves a bit of its own section. So how are you going to approach your testing? Is there going to be functional testing internally? Are you planning on outsourcing any of your testing? And what are you expecting to get? So I guess, what are you anticipating getting out of that? So is it functional testing? Will it be certification testing? And how will you manage those? How will you manage any bugs that come back? What is your localization approach? And how will you test your localization? There are also, I guess, if you're releasing on mobile, how are you going to do your individual mobile testing to make sure that we're working on all of the different mobiles that work out there? So there can be, I guess, a number of things within this testing approach. And like I said before, please, if you have a section that you think should be in there and is very important for your game. For example, lore, characters. Add that so that it is a complete document that is very much tailored to your delivery. So tips for writing a PMP. A PMP is a living document. That is, it's a constantly evolving and updated document that changes as the project does. It is intended to be a snapshot of your project and at a particular point in time, and a guide as to what the project is and how it's being managed. As I've harped on about now, don't be scared to change the document sections to suit what's relevant for you and your project. Sections can be blank or TBA until you know how you want to manage these or you have more information. Another one which I have been guilty of is don't plan alone. So talk to your team. Use the knowledge that exists in your team to build out each of your sections and gain agreement on your management approaches. Not only does this help, but in terms of your single knowledge is never going to be more powerful than the knowledge that exists within your team in relation to their individual disciplines. This also works as, I guess, a commitment building tool and a consensus building tool around gaining agreement as to how you all want to deliver the project. So rather than myself as a producer walking in and telling the team how I want to manage them, listening to the team and asking them how they prefer to be managed. So this is why the PMP is individualized to your project, because your team are all individuals and prefer different things and different ways of a management. So talk to your team, ask them whether they like challenging milestones, whether they like relaxed milestones, whether they want to know where they are and how they're tracking for the project, or they don't want to hear about risks at all. Understand your team, talk to your team. You will gain more knowledge out of it and it will be better suited. Once you've done that, you will be able to tailor your management plan to your team much, much better. Build contingency time into your plans. This helps a lot. Obviously, please be cognizant of, I guess, the amount of time that you can build into a plan without it being too much contingency, but make sure you are building in contingency time to your plans. We all know life changes. We are up and down all the time, particularly now as we are all locked down. So sometimes things take longer than you have anticipated in your forecasts for no reason other than they just do. So build some contingency plan in there so that when you into your plan, so that when you are approaching new features, you do have some time to pivot if you need to. Set a regular schedule to review and update your project management plan and reflect on these changes. And I would suggest doing this again in conjunction with talking to your team. So talk to them and gather your lessons learned, the information that you've gathered through your retrospectives, and use this to talk to your team, develop your processes, and reflect on what's really working and what isn't. And my conclusion. So, project management plans assist with your planning, monitoring and controlling all aspects of project management and create a space in which to document all of those management approaches. It communicates the who, what, when, where, how and why of the development approach for your project. And so for that reason, it is a really handy tool, not only to prompt you to think about these things and how you're going to approach them, but also to document and gain consensus on those throughout your team. Effectively creating buy-in for the overall management approach, and it also creates a roadmap for your team and sets expectations for how that project is going to be managed. So, do you need a project management plan? Well, no, but they really are a useful tool. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate you coming to this talk. I know it's lunchtime, so please get yourself something to eat, have some water. I will be back in a second just to answer some Q&A for you. If you have any questions for me, contact me on now, or contact me on Twitter at Jess McPants. Like I said, I really appreciate you coming to listen to my talk, because I know it's lunchtime, but have a lovely day and thanks for coming. Bye.